every time there is a bubble, a trend, a hype, or any big new thing that's going to happen in the tech industry, you unavoidably start seeing a bunch of people are going into what I call suicide ventures. Suicide ventures for me are any kind of project, product, or company that is being built, started without having some of the most fundamental things to support their success. And therefore, you're basically, most of the time, unknowingly going into a venture that is has the exact same chances of success or what we understand, as a pop culture as a suicide mission. That's why I call them suicide ventures. And so most of the time, the kind of fundamentals that these ventures are missing are, lack of true demand. You believe that you have a demand, but that demand hasn't really formalized itself. And so therefore you realize that, people aren't really ready to spend the resources and the money in buying what that venture is producing. You don't have the infrastructure. You don't have the means to actually execute what you would need. Like you're trying to build a submarine company from the middle of Oklahoma or in the middle of Luxembourg, and you're not in a position where you're going to be able to actually support these things, or you want to be building a big tank company. I'm using defense because I'm going to talk about this in a second. From your mom's garage with no access, no understanding of the requirements and compliance that is necessary to work on systems like this, etc. The list goes on. Or you don't have access to the talent. You don't have it in your core team. You don't have it, where you haven't figured out where that talent is. You haven't figured out what talent you need to build what you're trying to do. This one is coming back with a vengeance these days. Or the last one, the big one, is that you don't have the resources. Money is a big one, but that's not the only one. And when I'm saying you don't have the resources, it can be that you don't have the right resources, because you could have a ton of money, but not having access to the right resources that you need to, not having decided to create these resources if this is the only way to get to it. Or you can have, you can have the money, but just not enough money for what the venture that you're actually going for is asking for. And none of these moments, none of these fundamentals are coming crystal clear. Nothing is ever presented to you with a nice pros and cons list with a clarity to it that, you just can make the decision. So if you find yourself in a suicide venture, I feel for you. I know that you didn't mean to. I mean, some people are kind of like recklessly going into it, but the majority of people that find themselves in there, they don't really mean to. But that's kind of the point of this video. The point of this video is to bring in this topic of conversation at a conscious level, because it's a thing we don't really like to talk about in the tech industry, especially in Silicon Valley. We don't talk about the failures. We don't talk about why things have failed. We just brush it off in the back and then move on to the next hype, because that's kind of what is going on. But there's a bit of a Wall Street bets, degenerate gamblers mentality to this whole thing. And there's real damage that has a real serious impact on the feasibility of the next wave when we let this stuff happen. And that's why I want to talk about this. So I'll give a couple of examples of where things I touched on concepts, but I'll use a couple more practical examples. And I'm going to use drone examples because they're tied to what I'm going to touch on in a second. But if you're a drone company that you're building yourself from scratch and you don't have a single person in your team that has the experience and the know-how on actually building, the electronics, the mechanical, the software on it, I mean, the case for the suicide venture is making itself and writing itself in front of you. If you are a drone company and you have raised a ton of money, but you actually do not have the manufacturing capabilities or the things that you need, and it's not something you want, or you're arguing with this, you're creating your suicide venture. And that's the part that is actually, very, very important. If you're a drone company and you have been, raising just a little bit of money, but you've never really had the means to actually build all the components that you need to deliver the experience your customer is expecting to, and then you're basically decided to aggregate a bunch of parts who are barely working together. And I'm not saying this from the point of being very judgmental from my standpoint of my experience in the drone industry. I'm saying this because this is how the customer judges the product at the end, because they're used to something that works really, really well and they don't want to bargain on this whole thing. Same story. You get yourself into a suicide venture a little bit. This applies to absolutely every single aspect of technology. I'm touching on this on the drone side because, again, it's going to be relevant with my last point. But it applies to absolutely everything. It applies to people who are vibe coding through the apps right now and they haven't put a thoughts into what's going to happen when time's going to scale. That guy that went viral because Replit just wiped out his database and just like things. I mean, AI is wonderful. I use it every day. But if you don't have a single bit of technological know-how on how to operate this technology, I used to say this, if you don't deal with your issues, they're going to deal with you. Well, if you don't deal with the AI is going to deal with your stuff. And this is showing it more and more as what it is. I'm super simplifying a bigger topic, but I don't want to drift. The reason we got into this particular situation is because we have been evolving for pretty much 20 years into an information bubble, right? Social media put this on steroids and doing a full on 24/7 information war. But we evolve in a bubble where there's always someone trying to just push a narrative, an agenda, an argument, a position, on what things should be, right? And then these days you hear it a lot. You hear stuff like, if you're not, you're the engineer, sorry, who uses AI is gonna be replacing the engineer that doesn't use AI. You hear all sorts of stuff like this, like a lot of like very cold statement, and all of them have this. Those who are really fanning the suicide ventures really have a commonality that they are here to create FOMO, fear, panic, and all this different stuff. And as I covered in my book, you got to ask yourself, like, who benefits? Who benefits from these posts and what they're trying to do, etc. And you'll realize, again, I covered the whole thing in the book, so read this if you want to have the details. But basically, most of the time, people are just trying to push what's in their own narrative. It's not like an evil plan to dominate the world or anything. But if you're going to start consuming in this information and bringing it into your thinking process about what's going to be your next venture and how you're going to do it, you got to ask yourself, like, what's in it for this person to tell me this thing right now, including this video. I'm living what I'm preaching. But most of the time is you have someone who's trying to create demand. So they're building a piece of tech. They got themselves into suicide ventures a few years back under the promise that it was going to be some sort of interest, or their analysis that the problem they had inside had to be solved the way they were saying, which is, super not given, and then trying to defend that this is the best solution, etc. That could be just this simple. A thing that is really happening is you start seeing governments who are trying to incentivize directly on an ideological front private money to come in and sustain and build an industry to support their needs, without necessarily having the demand. And this is always kind of like, for me, the best answer to this thing is just like, stop telling me what to do. Just show me demand, show me an actual contract, show me an actual requirement. It's really a part important because it takes one of the fundamentals I'm talking about. But the list goes on and on and on like this. And if you actually buy into these things, you can buy in early. You can jump in as you see an opportunity and momentum going on early on. There's an entire range where you can jump in, from very early on where you have a high risk of suicide venture to a later on where the risk is a lot lower, but you got to come heavier and harder to actually being able to catch up with those who would have a little bit of a first mover's advantage, although I'm not a big subscriber of the idea that it's a real thing. You can do that, but that's a risk profile that you're going to have to be able to characterize and understand and really see where you're going. And what I'm saying is that I'm saying a lot of people are coming early because they think it's about being first. A lot of people are trying to double leapfrog technologies. They want to be building the thing that they think you're going to need tomorrow, but the things you're going to need the day after. And then they try and then to hold the bag until the rest of the market is catching up with them. And in this, because they really had no characterization of how much of a suicide venture what they were doing was, what they wanted to do could even be. And what they find themselves in is they find themselves in being right at the wrong time, which is the exact same thing as being wrong. And in the popular culture, we love to praise the people who were just like fighting the adversity of everyone, and everybody was telling them they were wrong, and at the end they were right. And it's just like, this is really great. But what I'm trying to say is just that you're still wrong, right? And the fact that you managed to get through this entire experience and on top is good for you. I'm not taking any of that away from you. But as a pure risk management of this entire venture that you're going into, you cannot honestly dismiss all of the people that got chewed out and spit it out through the entire thing because they went as well into a suicide venture, and for they faced the similar reasons that you faced, and they didn't make it. Now the reason why this matters is because this has happened in the drone industry already once, and there's three types of people that usually get caught into this. You have the founders that are going in, like they spent all their time, their money, their energy, their life, their sacrifices into building a venture, and it doesn't pan out because they built something that was too early, or the wrong things, or again it was a suicide venture of any kind. You have the VCs to back them up. These VCs who are usually now find themselves in a position where the entire industry or a segment of the industry is now written off, and they move on. They don't come back to it, and they because they don't want to, because they're burned, because most of the time they just can't even make the pitch. No one wants to hear it because they'll bring back like, oh yeah, but you remember back then we actually have this whole thing and it didn't turn out. And then the last piece is the talent. You have a lot of people who move away from the whole industry when things don't turn out really, really well. And that means that you have three categories of people, and other people in all three, who are just no longer in the talent pool when this reset is going to happen. The reset almost always happens. You try again and again and again. This is how technology is being built, right? Social media didn't start with Facebook, right? It started with MySpace. It started with all those things. MSN. I remember that back then Hotmail was the thing that we used to think as the late players of the internet was coming on these things. Same for the phones, for the mobile industry. Didn't start with the iPhone. Didn't start with the things. There was Palm in the 90s as the first things, and then the Newton by Apple even before that. And it's like through trial and errors, etc. But that's actually I'm gonna pivot on this for a second. That the Apple Newton was exactly what I mean about a suicide venture. And then there's like fanboys about it, and I respect this because I played with it and it was very impressive back then, right? But they just didn't have it. They didn't have what was necessary to deliver the product. I also don't think that they had what was necessary to know that it was not going to be able to work. And sometimes you do need to actually go through these things to just know this stuff. You got to ask yourself if you want to be that person. Okay? So the context of why I'm bringing this up right now is because defense tech is coming back with a vengeance. A lot of people coming in. There's been a lot of, patriotism and a lot of, loud talking and, super huge optimisms and excitement across the board, etc. Lots of genuine good things coming from all over the West. On the policy side, on the thought leadership side, across the board, there's been a lot of real, genuine, positive things. But there's been recently a couple of things that are starting to show sign of suicide venture galore. And there's a VC I recommend you guys all to follow. His name is Michael Jackson. He's an American VC, I believe, living in Paris. He does a great job at curating content and giving you, spotlight things. You don't have to agree with everything he says, but he's always like putting your eyes on things that are very relevant. He was pointing out how Italy was trying to get a bridge between Sicily and the mainland count as spending on the percentage of GDP they have to do as part of the NATO membership. And he highlighted this, which I think rightfully so, as a sign of stress of the government in terms of the funding capabilities on how they're trying to just kind of like route things that they were going to do anyway into the defense spending to actually get there. Which, if you are on the bandwagon of thinking that defense tech is going to be that new gigantic pool of cash and opportunity that everybody can get to, it's sending the opposite signal. The other thing that came out was the article from Bloomberg where they were covering how the German government has announced that it will be procuring about 8,300 drone systems over the next 10 years. Much smaller number than anybody else expected. And so sends a similar signal. Like, is the demand really what it's been propped up to be, right? And there's been people who are, I think, fighting these things, starting to write posts on LinkedIn. And you see them, like what I was saying, like, they're probably engaged into this and trying to actually defend the demand and, creating it for real. And just so we're clear about this, because I'm not attacking defense or the demand of it. I think that what we've been seeing coming out of Ukraine is a definitive signal that armies around the world have to redefine what they're doing. And I think that every single one of them is doing it. But I think that characterizing the exact state of the demand, the exact state of the timeline, the exact state of resources, the exact position that you have to be in to be able to survive these things and not engaging yourself in a suicide venture is very, very, very important. Because we're talking about building a very difficult technology for a very demanding customer, rightfully so. And I'm seeing a lot of YOLO, and people are going in pretty aggressively in this whole thing. And I'm seeing this built up of suicide ventures. And it's going to end up into the same thing I mentioned before. So there's this people are starting to post things on LinkedIn arguing about, the state of things. One of the posts that I saw was saying defense tech needs a spine, right? It needs to grow a spine. And they were kind of like, arguing that, more money needs to come in from the VC world to actually, build up all these different things, etc. And I thought this was a very interesting position, because fundamentally what it's expecting is just like VCs are supposed to be taking the risk that, government customers should actually be taking. That's not the role of VCs. The VCs, they're here to just like do this analysis that I'm talking about. I mean, they do a lot more, right? They characterize companies over 1,000 points. And then they're going to come around. It's like, is it the right time for what we decided to do? Right? And what they decided to do is it formalized around the fund. This fund has some criteria, parameters. LPs are on board with what this fund was about. And then they put this fund to work into the parameters that are in there. They're not here to just throw stuff at the wall to prove to the world that, they have big balls, right? They're here to really try to create, successful stories and characterize the entire thing, etc. And what this is interesting is because, again, seeing this article, and I really understand where the person came from, and I'm obviously hyper summarizing the entire thing. But the part that was very interesting for me is that it started to be a sign that we're getting into a big defense tech hype right now. A big wave like this, it's gonna be a marathon because the customer needs to take the time to actually, test and validate everything they're trying to do. It's gonna be about building difficult technology that's gonna take a lot of knowledge and a lot of expertise and a lot of resources to actually going in there. I'm hearing more and more about companies who are raising crazy amount of money to be going after building these things and trying to become too big to fail. And there's a significant amount of following of all of these things that are happening. That's going to create a significant risk of suicide ventures coming out. And so that came out to be the right context for me to bring up my take on this entire concept and leave you with a cautionary tale about, these things. I'm not telling you not to take the risk. I take risks all the time. I have a high sensitivity, high tolerance for risk. And I have a high level of optimism. Believe me, I've paid the price about these things. I've signed up for things I really shouldn't have because they were half-baked, etc. across the spectrum. But I will respect this. I think it's very important to actually take chances at things. But going in and taking these chances with an understanding about the actual risk that you're going in will always be better than going blindly and waking up at the 11th hour and realizing that you got yourself locked in a suicide venture.